Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is New York's Energy Storage Roadmap and Other Initiatives. This webinar is being presented by the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as ESTAP. ESTAP is a collaboration of the U.S. Department of Energy, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And our host for today's webinar is Val Stori. Val's a project director here at CESA. We have a number of excellent panelists also on the line with us. But before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using a telephone or via your computer's mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can do that by clicking on the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console. And on the webinar console, one thing that we would love for you to do is to submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar. You can do that by typing them into the question box that you see circled here and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in throughout the webinar, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We do have a lot of people registered for this webinar, and we do expect to get a lot of questions. So to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the webinar recording via email within about 24 to 48 hours, hopefully this afternoon. And we'll also be posting the webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And that's a good web address to know because that is also where we list information about our upcoming webinars, as well as all of our archives. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Val Stori. As I said, Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Sam, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm going to try to keep my introductory remarks as short as possible so we can move on to the great content that the panelists have prepared for you. So just a brief introduction to the Clean Energy States Alliance, otherwise known as CESA. CESA is a nonprofit organization. We're based in Montpelier, Vermont, and we work with our member organizations, which are mainly state clean energy offices and affiliated public agencies from across the U.S. We work with them to advance clean energy markets through policy support, information exchange and analysis, and partnership development. And on your screen, you can see our current members. So this webinar is part of CESA's ESTAP project, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership. The Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership is managed by CESA and conducted in partnership with Sandia National Laboratory and funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Through ESTAP, we work with our members and other stakeholders to accelerate energy storage deployment. We provide technical assistance for energy storage demonstration projects, and you can see some examples of those projects on the map on the right. And we also help to support states and their energy storage policies. So today we have four panelists, four presenters. First, we will hear from Dr. Imre Gyuk, and he's going to give us some background on New York's first foray into energy storage. And then we'll hear from NYSERDA and the DPS team on the rollout of New York's energy storage roadmap and associated energy storage policies and actions that are supporting the deployment of New York's 3,000 megawatts by 2030 storage goal. We'll also hear about New York's market acceleration activities and their efforts in soft cost reductions and their technical assistance program. I'm going to introduce each panelist before his presentation. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Imre Gyuk. He is a director of Energy Storage Research at the Office of Electricity at the U.S. Department of Energy, where for the last 2 decades he has directed the Electrical Energy Storage Research Program, developing a wide portfolio of storage technologies for a broad spectrum of applications. He has supervised the $185 million ARA stimulus funding for grid-scale energy storage demonstrations, and he's now partnering with states on numerous storage projects for grid resilience. His work has led to 11 Research and Development 100 Awards, 2 EPA Green Chemistry Challenge Awards, and a Lifetime Achievement Award. He is internationally recognized as a leader in the energy storage field. Dr. Gyuk, thank you for joining us.
Hello there. As you have heard, I'm with the Department of Energy, and I'm involved in energy storage. And since we are talking about NYSERDA today, I would like to provide a little bit of historical background. In fact, I will take you all the way back to September 2003. At that time, Joe Sayer was program manager at NYSERDA. And since I had served as reviewer on a number of projects for NYSERDA, I invited Joe Sayer back to our own program review in the ESTAP meeting in California. And over a drink, we agreed to do a joint solicitation. Well, by March 2004, NYSERDA and DOE signed a joint MOU with the intent of a joint energy storage initiative. Simultaneously, we also signed one with the California Energy Commission. And then by June, NYSERDA issued a $3.5 million PON number 846 as a joint solicitation with the Department of Energy. And that was the beginning of the involvement, serious involvement of NYSERDA in energy storage. The first project we did turned out to be quite important. In fact, we did the project simultaneously with NYSERDA and with the California Energy Commission, and it had to do with using energy storage for grid frequency regulation. First time this had been done. We tested a 100 kilowatt unit using flywheels, and the experiment both with NYSERDA and with the California Energy Commission turned out to be a great success, and it went on to a larger demonstration of 20 megawatts as a facility. And eventually, by 2011, FERC Order 755 mandated pay for performance. And from then on, frequency regulation using energy storage became a commercially viable business in FERC-compliant regions. This was really the first time that energy storage had a commercial, viable, bankable project in this field. Well, from then on, NYSERDA and California went on to become leaders among the states in energy storage, and they have done terrific work in advancing the energy storage. Well, it turns out that in the present day, we also, again, are supporting a project together. And that has to do with regenerative braking on urban rail. Basically, nowadays, the energy of a braking subway train isn't stored. It's simply burnt off as heat. Instead, we have a project to introduce storage, again in the form of flywheels, but of course much bigger flywheels that can 1 megawatt at 90 seconds. And DOE and NYSERDA each have about $2.5 million in the game. And if this turns out to be, if this turns out to work, it's going to be a really tremendous thing because it will become a $10 billion market. It will cut the cost of running metro trains fantastically and save a lot of carbon dioxide. So, NYSERDA will no doubt do more tremendous projects, but I wonder whether there is a future collaboration with DOE that can occur. Thank you.
And thank you. Thanks for the historic context and for bringing us from the past to the future. I just wanted to remind listeners to go ahead and type any questions as they come up for you in the question dialog box on your console. It should be on the right side of your screen. All right, so moving on, I'd like to introduce Marco Padula, who is the Director of Office of Markets and Innovation at the New York State Department of Public Service. His responsibilities include leading the implementation of the New York Public Service Commission's energy storage goal and deployment policies. He also leads the development and implementation of New York's Reforming the Energy Vision, otherwise known as REV's policies and programs. He's also responsible for the planning and oversight of New York State's clean energy initiatives. Marco, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Val. And thank you to everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in the webinar today. I'm going to talk about New York's energy storage roadmap, how we got to where we're at today, and where we're at in terms of implementation. I'll be followed by my colleagues from NYSERDA, who will get into more details on specific bridge incentive mechanisms that are currently in place. Let me just move the slide. I'm going to touch very briefly on New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I'll get into details of the New York Energy Storage Roadmap and deployment policies. And Jason and Schuyler will follow with details about the market acceleration incentives and soft cost reduction and technical assistance programs. New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, as many of you I'm sure have heard of, was signed by the governor back in mid-July. It has very aggressive renewable targets. I'll make note of a couple of them: the 70% renewable electricity by 2030, 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. And if you look at the bullets below that, those are really the programs that are going to get us to reach those goals. But with the focus on storage, just wanted to set the stage with this slide, saying that storage will really be a significant role in achieving those targets. And I'll walk you through the storage roadmap in the next couple slides. Where did we start? Well, we started back in the beginning of 2018 when our governor announced a storage goal by 2025 of 1,500 megawatts. That really triggered myself and Jason and Schuyler to co-lead the development of the energy storage roadmap for New York State. It was really supported by an energy storage study that looked at how much storage do we think is viable over the next 2025 to 2030 timeframe. The storage roadmap was released and made public in mid-2018. That was followed by significant stakeholder outreach and engagement and formal written comments And all of that was taken into account and presented to the Commission for Commission decision back in December of 2018. Following that, there were implementation plans filed by the utilities and NYSERDA to carry out many of the initiatives which we will describe in the subsequent slides. And we're really currently in the implementation phase, the early implementation phase today as we speak. The roadmap itself took a comprehensive look at the primary use cases of storage by market segments. And those market segments that were defined are listed here. They include customer-sited use of storage, distribution-sited use of storage, and bulk system use of storage. And you can see the various ways in each of those market segments that storage can be used to benefit either the customer or the distribution system or provide a service to the bulk system. So big picture, the order that was put out by the Commission in December adopted the goals of 1,500 megawatts of storage by 2025 and 3,000 megawatts of storage by 2030. These are incremental numbers, incremental to anything that existed today. And the order really did this by addressing barriers. Those barriers are things such as rules and tariffs, utility business models. I'll get into some of those in subsequent slides. And also by identifying the need to accelerate the energy storage market learning curve, drive down storage costs through the use of what we're calling a market acceleration bridge incentive. We'll get into more details on that as we move on. But one thing I do want to point out is that all of these measures are intended to enable a self-sustaining market. And that's really critical to reaching the levels of storage that we have in our goals and objectives. At this point, I'll walk through the major policy and program initiatives that are required by the order, starting with retail rate actions. And these really have to do with requiring utilities to implement new optional rate designs that better reflect the cost causation of the delivery system. In particular, the standby, buyback, and charging cost issues, they were addressed by a recent commission order back in May that requires utilities to make tariff filings of more granular standby rates, and those filings will be coming in September. The idea is once those tariffs are offered, customers should be able to use storage to respond to those more granular price signals, providing benefit to both the customer and the system as a whole. Second on this slide has to do with value stack changes. And let me just spend a moment on the term value stack and value of distributed energy resources. This is a concept in New York that we use to value injections of distributed resources. It's really our transition from net metering, where we've adopted a tariff-based approach to value every injection from a distributed resource and specifically identify the energy value, capacity value, environmental value, distribution value, and provide those in the form of credits to either a community DG program or project or a remote net metering project or any other distributed energy resource that would like to inject and receive those values. The storage order identified the need to make some of those components of the value stack more bankable, specifically the distribution value and the ICAP value. And those have since been modified to do that, and we believe that those changes have been very receptive to the market and produce positive results. Third on this list is dynamic load management. This is really the statewide demand response programs that are run by the utilities. And the recommendation here is to implement longer-term 3 to 5 year contracts under those programs instead of having a year-to-year approach where the price can change. This gives a little more certainty to both the utility and the demand response provider, with the idea of being able to better utilize or have more confidence in making a storage investment to participate in a program like that. Another major policy initiative is direct procurement. This was a major policy initiative in the storage order. It directs utilities, those New York State utilities, to expand on their non-wires alternative approaches to seek opportunities that would include reducing ICAP through load reductions and provide value to all of their utility ratepayers. In addition to that, utilities must procure what we're calling bulk dispatch rights for storage. And my next slide actually gets into more details on that. And so I'll save the details on that. It's a pretty important piece of the storage order, and you'll hear more about that in just a second. Additionally, NYSERDA will continue to look at how the renewable energy credit procurements can be modified to give flexibility or additional points to those projects that pair the renewable generation with storage, both enabling more renewable generation and a more effective use of that program. So the utility bulk dispatch rights. The commission storage order requires each utility in New York State to procure a minimum amount of storage that would be operational by December 31st, 2022, with specific minimum targets of 300 megawatts for Con Edison and 10 megawatts in each of the other utilities. It's expected that these are 4-hour duration systems, and that if the results of the RFPs come in and demonstrate that it looks like more megawatts could be procured, it doesn't preclude that. And in terms of schedule, Con Edison and O&R are really at their schedule is a little bit different than the other utilities. They are a little bit faster. So their RFP has been issued, it's on the street, and the remaining utilities will be issuing their final RFPs in the fall. But there's a link here that you can go to actually see more details of that RFP and all the requirements associated with it. The next major requirement out of the order is the clean peak requirements. We recognize that there's tremendous opportunity for storage to offset peaking unit operation, and the commission required the staff of the department and the ISO and NYSERDA and DC and LIPA to get together to really look at what is the potential for storage to either replace or partially replace the use of the peaking units that exist in New York City and Long Island that essentially have NOx emissions that will be subject to more stringent requirements that currently are draft, but will be coming down the road very soon. That report has actually been completed and is posted on the department's website, and the link is also provided here in the presentation. Following the actual issuance of the DEC NOx regulations, the PSC is expected to institute a proceeding where the utilities that are impacted by that, specifically Con Edison and Long Island Power Authority, would be required to develop what is called a peaking unit contingency plan to really look at what is the impact of not having those peaking units in service, if in fact they can't abide by the regulations, and various other scenarios to give us a good picture to how storage could be a replacement or a hybrid solution to eliminating or reducing the NOx emissions from those peaking units. There are also other actions that address clean peak in the order. The one being differentiating the environmental value in the value stack. Currently, that environmental value is the same for every hour of clean energy injection, but the storage roadmap recognized that there could be benefits to differentiating that value between peak and off-peak, or maybe even more granular than that, to arrive at a higher value, an environmental value at certain times of the day versus other times of the day. And there is still outstanding a staff white paper that will make proposals related to a more granular E value. Wholesale market recommendations were another major topic addressed in the Commission's order, really to reaffirm that the Department of Public Service and NYSERDA will and shall continue to be active participants in the ISO working groups, and we encourage all those that are in New York and have storage interests to do the same. There's a tremendous amount of work going on there related to rules and regulations related to storage. We specifically, in that order, urge the ISO to exempt energy storage from the buyer side mitigation rules. And if some of you do know already, or we want to note that the Department of Public Service, along with NYSERDA, did recently file a complaint to FERC to do just that, to get storage exempted from the buyer side mitigation. That filing was made back on July 29th and is going through the process at FERC to have them act upon that. The order also established principles for dispatch priorities really related to dual participation. One of the things that the roadmap identified was that storage was unique in that it could provide multiple services to really maximize the use of the storage and maximize the benefit provided to the system. So we want to really ensure that a storage project can provide distribution benefits to the distribution utility, or at the same time provide services to the wholesale market and get paid accordingly for all of those services that it provides. I would note there is also the requirement to convene what is called a market design and integration working group that's driven by the Department of Public Service and NYSERDA. It's really looking at what is the necessary planning, coordination, and control and dispatch of any type of DER to enable dual participation, again, at the distributed system platform level and at the wholesale level. That's an ongoing working group. It's anticipated to continue well into 2020, and would encourage all of you to follow what's going on there. There's some really good information being developed that will then be presented to the Commission, and the Commission will act upon that and instruct utilities how to move forward in more specific development of the distributed system platform that we envision under the REV scenario proceeding. Data requirements. In the order, it was recognized that data is extremely valuable, especially if it can provide certain type of information. And one of the things that was envisioned was that if you take customer data and asset data and system data, and we're able to issue queries on that data, could it provide valuable information for storage developers or actually other type of DER developers as well? That's a pilot that is currently in the works. It's moving along on schedule and on time, and by the end of this year, we are expected to have results from that pilot to really see if that approach would provide valuable information. Lastly, there's a good amount of accountability in the storage order, specifically with an annual state of storage report and then a triannual review. The point that I do want to make here is that the annual report is expected to provide not only information on what has been the amount of storage that we've got installed in the last year, but what are the impediments or what hasn't worked well, what could be changed moving forward so that we can make those changes and continue moving along our path to achieving the storage goal. And with that, I'll now pass it back to Jason.
I've got it. Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Marco. Great. Just a reminder to folks to keep typing in your questions and we'll get to them the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour. Next, I'd like to introduce Jason Doling, who is the Assistant Director of the Distributed Energy Resources team at NYSERDA. This includes energy storage and also distributed solar and on-site power like fuel cells and combined heat and power. Jason, thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move a little quickly through these slides just so that we have plenty of time for questions. I'll point out some of these are included for additional information and with links for those that are really interested. And if you took one thing away from Marco's presentation, it was how comprehensive the storage order really was. It was not a piecemeal order. And so also I think what's very obvious to many people is some of those actions happened immediately. Some of them happen in the near term. Some of them are a little bit longer term in nature. So one of the things importantly that the Commission recognized is we don't want to wait to get everything right, which is why it becomes so important to talk about the acceleration incentives that are now available. I will also just point out, Schuyler and I will not be talking about any of the work that the R&D side of NYSERDA, what's now called Innovation and Business Development, covers. So just know that storage product development in field testing and demonstrations for smart grid applications, buildings, transportation, and technology deployment, that is all still well underway, and funds are awarded through competitive solicitations. You're going to hear about a different side of NYSERDA today. So in total, the amount of acceleration incentives that we have is just about $400 million. I'll highlight a few things here. The first is that Long Island's a bit different in terms of how funds are made available because they're not ratepayer collected funds. So if you look at the first two bullets on that page, the way we filed our implementation plan was we know that our best expectations for how the future is going to evolve are going to be wrong. So we allocated, at this point in time, almost an equal amount of money between what we'll call retail incentives and then bulk incentives. and we still have unallocated funds. And what we have publicly said is we will allocate those funds to the use cases where we see the greatest potential for enabling sustainability outside of incentives. The other point that I'll quickly make here is the analytical work that helped lead to the targets. The exciting piece of that, these are not viewed as being maximum amounts of storage that could be deployed. It's a huge amount of storage that's coming online in addition to the existing 1,400 megawatts of pumped hydro storage that we have. There's almost 100 megawatts of advanced storage that's online. So we still have quite a ways to go through 2025, but as you'll hear, the pipelines are enormous. The other thing worth pointing out, though, is the study that looked at how much storage was beneficial as we reach the year 2030 was based on a world that had 50% renewable penetration for electric generation. And that world's now 70%, leading to 100% carbon-free electricity 10 years later in 2040. So we would suggest that the energy storage market is definitely bookended between New York and California as being the two most significant markets in the country. So I'm going to quickly walk through the retail side of the house, and then Schuyler will talk about the bulk side. In our parlance, retail essentially means any project that would be subject to the Public Service Commission's standard interconnection requirements. So that's projects up to 5 megawatts of AC. It could be located with customer load. It could be in front of a customer's load connected directly into the distribution system. In particular, we really looked at what had been done elsewhere, especially our friends in California, to not overly complicate project requirements in a way that would harm the economics. So on the bottom bullet, you'll see what is required if this is a customer-cited solution, which most often means they're either participating in demand response, they enroll in a more granular delivery rate, or it's compensated under the value stack tariff that Marco mentioned for export. The other point really that we've seen come to fruition in the last 6 months is I would suggest that value stack tariff is the most comprehensive and inclusive tariff anywhere in the country. It is the only one I'm aware of that actually allows the very valuable capacity benefit, particularly in downstate New York, to be included within a distribution tariff. So as we continue to get dual market participation rules implemented, this is a way to allow a developer and a customer to be paid for that very large value in the wholesale markets without actually interacting with the wholesale market. This is done as a $1 per kilowatt hour incentive. There's 3 regions, essentially New York City, Long Island, the rest of state. They each have their own set of blocks. The types of use cases that we're expecting to see in those looks a bit different. We pay 100% of the incentive once the project reaches commercial operation, and we are planning to do a quality assurance inspection on 100% of installations until there's a track record from the developers. Any project up to 15 megawatt hours that is up to 5 kilowatts is eligible in this program, and the incentive is paid directly through a participating contractor, and that directly reduces the cost or the lease costs to the customer. So if you were to click on this dashboard, you'll actually see public transparency of where we are in these different blocks. I included the rest of state block just as an example, where we're in block 3. In New York City and Con Edison, we're still in block 2. I'm going to keep moving just for the sake of time. And on this slide, for those that actually have project applications, the most important thing to recognize here is the third bullet. So the interconnection application submitted to the utility, the CSER's been completed, and 25% down payment has been made. And then finally, for the technical requirements, this is for commercial products. So we require a 10-year warranty that's determined between the customer or end user and the manufacturer. We do require the UL applicable listings that you see, but we don't require those be in place until the project is being commissioned. So we recognize there's a lot of developers that are still going through that. And then finally, the third bullet talks about the minimum round-trip efficiency that we require. That's based on a single charge-discharge cycle, and it's using the protocols that PNNL in Sandia had established. And I look forward to taking questions and turning this back so that Schuyler can talk us through the bulk program.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And moving on to Schuyler. Schuyler Matteson is a project manager in NYSERDA's Department of Distributed Energy Resources. He manages NYSERDA's bulk energy storage program. He works on emerging issues in energy storage, energy markets and regulation, system planning, distributed energy resources, and climate change. Schuyler, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go pretty quickly because we will be available for Q&A, and also all of this stuff is online through our energy storage website at NYSERDA, and you can always email. I think at the end of this presentation, there's a link to a email address that you can email that Jason and I both look at, and you can just ask us any questions through that email address too. So I'll try to go quick to stay under time. So the two paths to receive some of the $150 million under the bulk storage incentives. The first is through the NYSERDA standard offer, which is a declining block incentive. And the second opportunity is through the utility bulk dispatch rates contracts. I'm going to focus the next few slides just on number one, because Marco already kind of covered number two, and the utilities have their own information there. So under number one, we're looking at a declining block incentive for projects over 5 megawatts. And this is to basically build the market at the wholesale level for large-scale deployments and funding them based on their benefits to the system, like renewable integration, emissions reductions, and resiliency benefits. We also have another way where storage can participate in NYSERDA programs and at the state level and through our REC procurements by pairing with a large-scale renewable program, but I'll leave that to another time. You can look at our large-scale renewable program for those requirements. So the incentive structure for the large-scale bulk energy storage incentive program is just like the retail program. It's offered based on a fixed amount of usable kilowatt hours of the installed capacity of the storage. So projects that plan on providing ancillary services or energy arbitrage only, and that means no capacity value to that resource. The ancillary service projects will only receive 75% of the state incentive rate, and that's because we see a lot of value to ratepayers for providing that additional reliability benefit as well. There's no maximum project size that will incentivize, but the total NYSERDA incentive will be capped at $25 million per project. And once a project fills out a completed application, they lock in their incentive rate that's available at the time. And projects 20 megawatts and less have 18 months to achieve commercial operation, and projects over 20 megawatts have 24 months to achieve operation after the completion of their class year study, which is their interconnection studies through the New York ISO. Here's the incentive structure. This is also on our website. These represent the incentive rate that you would lock in if you applied according to the either time frame for the smaller projects or the class year specific information for the larger projects. So like I said, these are for projects over 5 megawatts. These are the larger projects operating primarily for the wholesale system. Once again, we're looking to fund commercially available systems, not necessarily demonstration projects. We have separate programs that could potentially look at that. We have a pretty high project maturity threshold, which is stage 9 of the NYSO interconnection queue, which essentially means the system impact study has been completed and they're about to enter the final phase of the NYSO class year process. The payment terms, we plan on paying the payments out over four separate payments. The first payment will be of 25% right at commercial operation once we've done our quality assurance inspection, and then payments 2, 3, and 4 will happen on each of the 1-year anniversaries of the project for years 1, 2, and 3. If the system's moved to a different location in New York State that's not eligible for the incentives, or if it's relocated, NYSERDA may seek a return of the incentive funding based on the prorated share of the time that it was in an eligible location. So there's a lot more information on our website. I can answer any other questions maybe later on or after once you send emails to NYSERDA's programs, but I'm going to think stop there.
Great, and I think it's back to you, Jason, for a few closing slides.
It is. So
Thanks.
as Schuyler mentioned, we covered a lot very fast. Just know if you'll see contact at the end. On our website, there's a 1-hour in-depth on the retail set of incentives, and there's the same on the bulk incentives. And there's also contact information for any additional questions. So really quickly, I just want to mention that New York State also is very fortunate to have the largest green bank in the country, which is a division of NYSERDA, and that's $1 billion of capital they have to invest. The important thing to know there is they're a much more deliberate, patient investor than may be possible with just private capital. A lot of times these projects are the first that it's been done. It's a new revenue stream. It's stacking different revenue streams together. And while their job is not to take on market risk that a developer should be taking on, they will put the effort into the due diligence and do that for a much smaller project and a non-portfolio based project when there's the opportunity for this to become a scaled market. So that's a really important resource that's available here in New York. When we think about where we can impact reducing costs, these components are the ones that are most significant. Where in New York, 25% on some projects of the install cost is these 4 items across the top of the page plus interconnection. I'm going to highlight just a couple of areas here. One is for vendor assistance. We do have resources to help understand tariffs, different market design, a calculator for the value stack compensation to understand what the project economics could look like. For quality assurance, on the very bottom right, we have a link to our DER system that lists every operational energy storage system in New York and the use case behind it. For customers, we have the ability to fund a technical and economic feasibility study to look at whether energy storage and other DER solutions can be effective for them and look at the economics. And we can fund up to 75% of that cost for projects that look at storage. And then finally, we are doing a lot of work with local governments to really help them understand how to appropriately consider energy storage and avoid going the route of the fear factor of something that was seen on YouTube the night before. We've been doing this in New York City for over 3 years. We have expanded this to statewide. The guidebook that we have is based on the 2021 International Fire Code. Any system that we fund must abide by those requirements. The Department of State in New York is also in the process of adopting the 2021 battery portion of the Fire Code as an emergency rulemaking. And the last point I'll highlight here is this is really to ensure that the industry accelerates as quickly as possible, but we avoid in every way possible the type of issue that was experienced in Arizona, where a lack of monitoring, gas sensing, deflagration venting, and so on resulted in harm to first responders. This is really all around trying to put preventative measures in place to make sure nothing could ever get to that point, and then provide training to first responders as well on how to address in this case, battery storage fire safely. And with that, we are happy to turn it back and take any questions.
Great. Thanks to all of you for such thorough and informative presentations. We've got loads of questions, so let's dive right in. Let me start with the first one for Imre. Why were flywheels considered for the metro train project? Were other technologies considered? You may be on mute.
No, I'm not on mute anymore. This is simply an exploration. Flywheels can respond faster than most batteries can. As was the case with the original project, the storage project that introduced frequency regulation, it may turn out that some batteries can do the same job.
Well, another technology question for the New York team. Are storage systems other than lithium-ion batteries eligible for any of your programs? And
Yeah, this is...
Is there a role for, part 2, any role for fuel cells in the roadmap?
Yes, I'll just quickly say I'm glad the question came up because I think we fell into the trap. We are technology agnostic, so any type of battery system, mechanical system, thermal systems are eligible. We have a separate fuel cell program in New York that incentivizes fuel cells, so that's not included in what we're talking about, but batteries, ice storage, chilled water, heat storage, flywheels are all in game.
Great, thank you. And given that a suite of technologies are eligible, how are your target storage numbers decided upon? For example, I believe you mentioned 3,000 gigawatts with a 4-hour duration.
Schuyler, do you want to quickly touch on the analytical work?
Sure. So a lot of these target numbers came directly out of the energy storage study, which was a optimization study looking at a 50% renewable system in New York State and what was the optimal build out, not just of storage, but of a full capacity expansion in New York State. What is the least cost system in New York State? And out of that system dropped 3,000 megawatts of storage in 2030. So this was not a random number, and it also wasn't a maximized storage number. It was a number based on the most benefits to New York State.
Great, thank you. Well, let's work backwards a little bit. So Schuyler, you finished up here. So what paths are intended for the demonstration bulk storage projects you talked about?
Could you say that one more time? What path?
Sure. Yeah. What existing paths do you intend for the demonstration bulk storage projects?
Well, for demonstration projects, we have a research and development program. We have Scott Egbert on our NYSERDA team can answer questions about that. But our first initial projects that are coming in through the bulk storage program are just kicking off now. We have lots of interest in New York State. There's a large interconnection queue at the NYSO. And so I'd be happy to answer any other questions about the deployment as well.
And Schuyler, it's probably worth just adding, so there's actually 5 gigawatts of storage in the NYSO queue right now. Now that's a whole range of project maturity and some speculative projects. But can you talk about the types of use cases that we're seeing in the applications coming in or the class here? That's probably getting to the heart of the question.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the use cases that we're seeing are these slightly longer duration storage assets where they're 4-hour resources wanting to locate downstate because there's high value for congestion, high value for capacity value downstate. So we see a lot of value there in longer duration storage. There's also certain projects that are looking to do shorter duration, 2-hour, 1 hour or less, to do frequency regulation and other ancillary services. So there's a lot of use cases in those projects that we see in the NYSO queue, but overall, like Jason said, there's huge interest in New York State at the retail and bulk level, and the bulk is over 5,000 megawatts of storage proposed so far.
And I'll just quickly add on the retail side, as we contract, all of the developers in the projects are made public. In the rest of state, where we're in that third block right now, that the blocks 1 and 2 were taken up with 25 large community solar projects. So these are 2 to 5 megawatt PV projects that were adding energy storage so that they could time shift and maximize the distribution benefit and the capacity benefit under that value stack tariff. And we're starting to see that for standalone storage projects as well.
Great, thank you. Somewhat related to that, someone asked a clarifying question. I believe you mentioned that 20 million of the incentives in Long Island are allocated to retail energy storage. Does that then lead to 30 million is set aside for bulk storage?
We're still working with LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority, to identify the way that bulk will be accelerated on the island. And it could go that route, or it could go through working with the utility through something akin to the dispatch rights contracts. So 15 million of the 55 million is currently on the streets, But what we've said is, as we start getting through blocks, we will continue to explore additional blocks with enough notice to developers based on where we're seeing movement in a path towards just a sustainable market.
Great. Thank you. Jason, this question is for you. Are there any incentives set aside for the public sector, for example, for municipalities, for a lead by example program, for example? Or do they just compete in your general incentive program?
There are not incentives set aside for that specific use case. The New York Power Authority does a lot of work specifically focused on the municipal sector. You'll also see in the near future, there's a very large low and moderate income and environmental justice focus that's going to be continuing to expand. So there will be specific set-asides that are related to deployments in those use cases, which start to include things like facilities of refuge.
Thank you. Marco, a couple of questions for you. Are there any penalties, utility penalties for non-compliance?
No, there are not.
Okay. How is anonymous data to be collected in the pilot program?
So the pilot program would take customer usage data and assign a random number to the to the data file, for example, without any information on the customer's public or private information, PII. And all of that customer data would go into this platform and queries could be run on it. When the query is run and identifies, say, 10 customers that look like they are interesting to a DER developer, then the request would go to the utility. The utility would get the customer sign off to provide the actual information to the DER developer. So all the customer information would remain anonymized on the platform, and it's only after the DER developer asks the utility would then ask the customer for the right to actually share the customer information.
Great, thank you. And this is probably the last question we have time for, and maybe a bit of a lengthier one, but someone has asked if you could further explain buyer side mitigation and the comments you have submitted to FERC.
Oh, Marco, that's got to be you. You have the quote of the day.
I can just do a high level, but maybe Schuyler wants to help a little bit as well. But my simple interpretation is guilty until proven innocent. That's the way we see the buyer side mitigation tests. But it's really intended to try to eliminate where there is a large amount of what we would call market power by a buyer to influence the market price at the wholesale level. And I think the nature of the comments is really, there's no intent whatsoever in any of these storage projects by the developer or the state to reduce market prices. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. There's affidavits filed in those comments that really dig into more specific details on the request. I would suggest reading it, but also if Schuyler or Jason want to add anything to that, that could be helpful during this response.
Sure. I could just add that the buyer-side mitigation tests are basically a test to see if any project is economical on its own when you compare the NYSO's modeled view of what your energy and ancillary services revenue would be compared against the NYSO's view of what future capacity prices would be. And they put those two things together, and if they think your project would be economical, then they'll let you participate in the capacity market. If they don't, then they keep you out of the capacity market by giving you an offer floor that you can't bid under and be economical in the market.
Perfect.
The final thing I'll round that out with is this is a lower Hudson Valley, New York City phenomenon in New York State, but that's the locations that have the highest capacity prices as well.
Great. Thank you. And we have reached the top of the hour. And so I'd like to thank all the panelists again. That was very informative. I think people have certainly enjoyed your presentations. I believe your contact info will be included in the slide deck, so folks can contact you with any follow-up questions. And of course, feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions. So thank you everyone for your attendance and for the great presentations. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.